Hey everyone, welcome. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, how political stories get made and how they can completely change what a country pays attention to. We're going to use the idea of the Hindu majority in India as our main example and really unpack how this concept became such a massive force in politics.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll pin down exactly what this unifying myth is all about. Then, we'll look at how it actually works in the real world. After that, we'll dig into its effects on caste and power structures, and finally, we'll check out some of the strategies being used to push back against it.
So this is the big question, right? It sounds like a total contradiction, but figuring out the answer to this is key to understanding a lot of modern politics, not just in India, but all over the world. It's a powerful strategy, and it's all about unity and mobilization.
All right, let's start at square one. What do we actually mean when we talk about the Hindu majority myth being used as a political tool? Okay, so at its core, it's a political game plan. The goal is to create this one single identity, Hindu, that can bring together a huge, incredibly diverse group of people who might not otherwise have a lot in common. And it does two things at once. First, it unites people by pointing to some kind of outside threat. But just as important, it pushes all the internal divisions, like the super complex and historic caste system, into the background.
So, how does a narrative like this get built? And more importantly, how does it stick? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this mobilization actually happens.
It really boils down to three main ingredients that work together. First up is cultural nationalism. This is the idea that India is, at its heart, a Hindu civilization. That creates the big, unifying story. Second, you have external threat framing. By pointing out supposed dangers from minorities or other countries, you create a kind of solidarity built on fear. And third, there's a claim of moral superiority, which paints Hindus as the ultimate guardians of the nation's values. You put those three together, and you've got a really powerful message.
And this is exactly the point. Check out this quote from the scholar Ranjana Kumar. She says, "This politics of fear isn't just for show, it's also a great distraction. It yanks the public conversation away from tough domestic issues, like economic problems and especially caste discrimination, and points everyone's attention toward outside dangers instead."
Now, here's maybe the most interesting part of the puzzle. If this whole narrative pushes the issue of caste to the side, why on earth do so many voters from lower caste communities find it so compelling? You'd think it would be a tough sell, but there are some very real, practical reasons it works.
Well, for starters, populist welfare programs can offer help right now, which can feel way more important than fighting for some abstract long-term change. Then there's the power of identity. Sometimes a shared religious identity can feel stronger or more important than a caste identity. Throw in the appeal of a strong leader who promises to protect you, plus some direct, tangible help from local political networks, and you've got a pretty persuasive package.
Okay, so what happens when this narrative takes hold? Let's talk about the real-world impact, what this all means for the very complicated relationship between caste and power in India.
And here's the bottom line. The entire national conversation changes. Suddenly, instead of talking about policies to fix centuries of caste-based inequality, everyone is focused on national security, protecting culture, and religious unity. The very issues that matter most to marginalized groups just get shoved off the table.
And that shift has very real costs. Lawmakers start paying less attention to caste-specific issues. Political movements for Dalit and advocacy communities can get broken up and lose their power to negotiate. The dominant culture's symbols can start to overshadow unique local traditions. And maybe most importantly, the real, structural problems that stop people from getting jobs or building wealth just never get fixed.
So you get this major gap between what's being said and what's actually happening. All the public talk is about social harmony and Hindu unity. But in reality, political movements that are built specifically around caste issues have a much harder time getting any momentum. They get fractured in a political climate that puts religious identity first.
So when the whole conversation moves away from fixing caste-based problems, it can unintentionally just lock in the historical advantages that upper caste groups already have. It's not necessarily a conscious plan, but it's the outcome. When there's less focus on things like affirmative action, the existing power structures in politics, media, and top jobs tend to stay just the way they are.
But this isn't a one-sided story. This narrative is definitely being challenged. So for our last section, let's look at the ways that activists, academics, and community leaders are trying to counter all this and push for real change.
You can boil down the counter strategies to three main approaches. The first is what you might call strategic reframing.
basically changing the conversation from being just about caste to being about universal ideas like human rights or economic fairness for everyone. That helps bring more people on board. The second is coalition building, teaming up with other groups like labor unions or farmers who have similar economic goals. And the third is using the legal system, going to court to protect existing rights and fight discriminatory policy.
And this is how those big ideas actually start happening on the ground. It often begins with simple stuff, figuring out who the local leaders and resources are, setting up an independent way to share info like a WhatsApp group, and teaching people what their legal rights are. From there, you can build formal partnerships and start setting real, achievable goals for local elections. This is how change really gets started.
And all that local action can eventually lead to bigger democratic reforms. Things like making sure existing election rules, like seats reserved for marginalized groups, are actually enforced, or using legal tools to challenge government policies. And this one is huge, promoting economic empowerment so that communities can build their own wealth and power without having to rely on political favor.
So, let's wrap this up. What are the big things to take away from all this? First, the Hindu majority narrative is a really effective political tool for getting out the vote. Second, by focusing so much on outside threats, it successfully shifts attention away from deep-rooted problems like caste oppression. And third, there are real, effective counter-strategies out there that focus on changing the conversation, building alliances, and using the democratic system itself to push for change.
And we'll leave you with one last thing to think about. The idea of unity is something every nation wants. But as we've seen here, it's so important to ask who is being brought together, on whose terms, and, maybe most importantly, whose problems get ignored in the process. Thanks for tuning in.